Hi class, welcome back. Today we're going to go through our chapter 2 of the American Yawp. This chapter is called Colliding Cultures, and we are going to be dealing with how European exploration transformed North America and the consequences for many of the indigenous peoples, also Africans and Europeans, where three cultures are all coming together on the continent of North America. So let's dive into this. Now, in the early 1600s, competition between European nations to control the New World is heating up. You've got Spain, which has occupied what is today Mexico. Portugal has moved into what is today Brazil. But the English and the French and the Dutch, they're all arriving, and they're seeking to share the wealth, the territory, and compete for that wealth and territory. Now, the English, for example, established Jamestown in 1607, almost 150 years or so, well, about 125 years or so after the Spanish had first arrived on the continent. The English had first put its flag down much earlier than that, but they didn't have the power or the resources or the drive to try to establish anything just yet. But by 1607, Jamestown becomes the first permanent English settlement in what is now the United States. There had been earlier attempts at Roanoke Island, but those had failed, and there's a great controversy and a bit of mystery over why it failed. We don't know. We don't have an answer. But Jamestown will last. The French will settle along the St. Lawrence River in Canada. The Dutch is going to create a fur trading empire around what is today New York. They called it New Amsterdam. And eventually the English will take over that area as well. Now, each nation had its own approach to colonization. The Spanish had focused on converting indigenous peoples to Christianity and to be loyal Spanish citizens, also extracting wealth through forced labor, which we talked a little bit about, the idea of encomienda. The French and the Dutch, on the other hand, they're more interested in trade, especially in furs, and they built relationships with the Native American tribes. So of the groups we're talking about coming out of Europe, the Dutch and the French are going to have the best relationship with some of the native peoples. The English, meanwhile, they're seeking to build permanent colonies, permanent settlements. They're looking to populate the area and to build a population, because remember, England is a relatively small nation, and its population has been growing over the last few years, partly because of the Columbian Exchange. And so while these settlements are being built, we're going to see clashes with local tribes over land and resources. Now, European colonization wasn't just a one-sided story of conquest, or it's going to be a competition. Native Americans are going to resist, and they will adapt to these new pressures in a number of compact ways. So think about the Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia, the Wampanoag in New England. As these new strange people began to arrive, they're going to have to deal with the changes, just like the new colonies are going to have to deal with new reality where they are. Now, in Virginia, and I mentioned Powhatan, the Powhatan Confederacy initially is going to help the struggling English settlers in Jamestown, but tensions are going to rise over English expansion. In New England, the Wampanoag people, allied with the Pilgrims, it's going to lead to the first Thanksgiving. This is one we talk about, Thanksgiving in New England and the Pilgrims and the Great Feast. Later conflicts are going to erupt as more English settlers begin to arrive. Now, this idea of Thanksgiving is something that was common throughout the English-speaking world. As a matter of fact, there was a Thanksgiving celebration a year earlier in Virginia. It doesn't have the glamour and the glitz and sort of the story that we think about with Plymouth. That's kind of interesting, and there's all kinds of details in history that are not always thrown out there, so that's my side story there. Now, Native American peoples, they used diplomacy, trade, even military force to deal with the European newcomers. And some tribes, like the Huron tribe, they become key trade partners with the French, while others, like the Pequots in New England, Pequots, they're nearly destroyed in wars between the English and indigenous. Resistance is going to remain a constant factor as these people can continue to push west, and as they push west, they're going to push the Native American peoples with them. Now, going into Section 3, we're talking about the growth of slavery in the colonies. One of the most tragic consequences of European colonization is going to be the growth of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, keep in mind that this goes all the way back to the Portuguese, which had established trading posts along the coast of Africa, and we talked about that last chapter. Now, as European colonies expanded, they're all going to need labor to work on these plantations, especially in the South. The Portuguese continue to bring slaves into the sugar islands of the Caribbean. The Spanish are bringing them over as well. But by the time we get into the 1620s, 1630s, 1640s, tobacco becomes a major cash crop in the South. It's fairly labor intensive, and the workers are needed to harvest those crops, which is a major money making factor. It is the sort of crop that's going to put Virginia on the map. Now, at first, Europeans relied on something called indentured servants, indentured servitude. And these are people who work for several years, usually in exchange for passage to the New World. These are people that couldn't afford to buy the boat ride themselves. And so what do? They say, hey, I will work for you for 4 or 7 or 12 years, whatever the terms of the contract would be. And when you had served that term, then you would have your freedom. There may have been a bit of a land price that was given, or maybe you were given the chance to raise a little bit of money to buy your own land once you were done. But where was that land at? That land was going to be farther to the west, again, putting pressure on the Native American peoples. And to encourage wealthy landowners to pay for these indentured servants, they were given something called a head right. This was a chance to be given some money or given some land, expanding their own property in the process, because death toll was very high in the southern colonies at the point of time we're talking about. And it's not unusual for someone to come over here as an indentured servant. They've got 7 years to serve, but they die in 6 months. It's not uncommon whatsoever. But this indentured servitude over time is not going to prove to be a lasting solution. So colonists began to turn to African slaves, seeing it as a more permanent and a more controllable labor source over the long run. Now, by the 17th century, the slave trade was central to the colonial economy, and millions of Africans were forcibly taken out of their homes. In many cases by other tribes which they would go to war with. We talked about this a little bit last chapter too. And that boat ride over, the trip over, was called the Middle Passage. It was very brutal. These people were piled onto on boats very close together. The health situation was not good. In fact, about 10% of those that left Africa to come to the Caribbean islands first, and then eventually up to the English colonies, about 10% will not make it across. About 10% is the number that will die typically. So on some ships more and on some ships less, but about 10% is the average of the mortality. The system would lay the foundation, though, for a racial hierarchy that would dominate American society for centuries, and we will continue to sort of bring up the issue of slavery as we move through the rest of this course. Now, religion is also going to play a major role in colonization as we move into Section 4. Many European settlers are going to come to the New World. They're seeking freedom, religious freedom. They're seeking for the chance to spread Christianity. That's one reason that the Puritans had come. And so the Puritans had established what was called Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, about 10 years after the settlement of Plymouth. And these two are very close together. Now, when the Pilgrims arrived, they did not have a piece of paper in their hand called a charter from the king. But when the Puritans arrived in Massachusetts Bay, they did have that charter. And so eventually, Plymouth will be absorbed into Massachusetts Bay Colony. And the purpose that the Puritans had was to create an example of what a religious society would look like, a shining, quote, city upon a hill. And this would be a society based on strict religious beliefs. They saw themselves as a model for the rest of the world. They didn't tolerate dissent with their communities. And so in some ways, this is religious freedom for me, but not for thee. If you were Catholic, you were not really welcome within the Puritan colony. Or if you opposed the way the Puritans handled their business, you were kicked out. And we may talk about a few of those individuals. Or as you read through these chapters, you will Anne Hutchinson, for example. Roger Williams would be another one. Now, meanwhile, Catholic missionaries from Spain and France, they're going to try to convert Native Americans to Christianity, often with mixed results. But the Catholics are also going to play a role in the English settlement as well, which we should get to, hopefully, in a few moments. Or you'll get to it in your reading, Maryland being the example. Now, for indentured peoples, European religion was both a threat and an opportunity. Some converts, while others are going to resist efforts for their traditional beliefs, and the blending of indigenous and Christian beliefs are going to create unique spiritual practices in some regions, particularly where contact with Europeans and native peoples are going to be much, much more in close contact. Now, Section 5. conflicts and wars in early colonization. So as the colonies expand, so did the violence. The 17th century is going to see a number of conflicts between European powers, indigenous people, Native Americans, American Indians, as well as between rival European colonies. Now, one major conflict is the Pequot War. I mentioned the Pequots before. The Pequots are in New England, and this war is going to spring up in 1636 and go to about 1637. It lasts about a year and a half. And the English settlers, along with their native allies, are going to nearly wipe out the Pequot tribe. Another was the Anglo-Powhatan Wars in Virginia, where the English are going to clash with the Powhatan Confederacy over land and resources. Now, this was a war that was avoided for a while because of the marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe. Now, John Rolfe, just sort of on a side note, is the man that introduced tobacco cultivation into the Virginia colony. And Pocahontas goes to visit England. He visits the royal family, and she actually winds up with tuberculosis, dies in England. She's buried in England. She never comes back to her native Virginia. Back to the wars, though. These wars are brutal. They're devastating for Native American population. It leads to the loss of land, sovereignty, and often entire communities. That, again, they're being pushed farther west. But it wasn't just the indigenous peoples that fought. Europeans are going to clash with each other also. In King Philip's War in 1675 and 1676 in New England, thousands are going to be left dead, and it's going to reshape the balance of power in the region. This is a war that breaks out between England and France, and also there's some Native American allies on both sides that get involved with this conflict. Now, Section 6 deals with gender and family life in the colonies. So let's talk about everyday life in the colonies. What was it like for the average everyday person just trying to get by? Gender roles and family structures are often shaped by European traditions and the demands of life in the New World here. In English colonies, for example, men were expected to work the land, participate in politics, to defend the community in the form of a militiaman. Women were tasked with running the household, raising children, assisting with farm work, passing on literacy if you were literate yourself. However, life in the colonies also offered new opportunities for women, especially in religious communities. The Quakers, for example, women had more of a voice in those communities than in other English-speaking populations. The Quakers are going to settle in Pennsylvania. Now, indigenous and African societies, they had their own gender roles, and some of them were challenged by European colonization. For example, most indigenous tribes were what we call matrilineal society. In a European society, I am a Ford because my father was a Ford, and my father was a Ford because my grandfather was a Ford. It's passed down through the male line, but in many of the Native American tribes, matrilineal means your line is traced through your mother, for example. And that's not how European systems work, and some Native tribes will adopt patriarchal norms and give up some of the things that they had practiced prior. So wrapping this up, so what's the big picture here? Chapter 2 of the American Yawp shows us the colonization of North America. It was not just about Europeans building new societies. It's about cultures colliding and how cultures are going to draw things from what the other cultures have. There'll be some pushback on those, but something new will be formed from this. European colonization brought violence, disease, it brought exploitation, and it also created new complex societies that as indigenous peoples, Africans, Europeans are going to interact in ways that are going to shape the future of this continent. Now, the legacies of these encounters can still be seen in the cultural, racial, social dynamics of America today, and understanding this history will be key to understanding how our modern world comes to be. So the question, why do we study history? Well, we learn where we come from, what are the mistakes that we've made, and so that's kind of what this chapter and the others we're going to go through will show us. So thanks for tuning in to this review for Chapter 2, and I hope it helped to clarify some of the key events and themes of early colonization. Now, if you enjoyed this video, you can thumbs up if you wish, and you can subscribe if you want to, and leave a comment if you would like some other topics covered. I'll see what I can do for you. But for the most part, if you're in my class this semester, I want you to use these to sort of refresh your mind on what we've studied in the past few weeks as you prepare for your exams. All right, take care. Thanks so much for tuning in.